Hello, boys and girls and babes. Welcome back to the Janae Talks Caps podcast. As always, thank you all so much for tuning in today. And we would like to invite you, if you haven't already done so, to please go ahead and subscribe to our podcast if you're enjoying your time here. We are available across all major podcast platforms, so go ahead and click on that subscribe button wherever you like to get your podcasts from. And we are back today with the NHL Entry Draft, as well as the start of NHL free agency now in the rearview mirror for the Caps and for the rest of the league. And so we have got a lot to talk about today, and we will start off with the NHL Entry Draft, where the Caps had themselves really a hell of a couple of days once again. The Caps under Ross Mahoney have always drafted well, but really these last 2 years now, that's 2 drafts in a row now where they've completely knocked it out of the park, really. And so we will dive into all of that. So for anyone who missed it, the Caps got to make 6 selections in the 2023 NHL Entry Draft. And so just to quickly recap those selections first, before getting into a more in-depth analysis, they drafted forward Ryan Leonard, 8th overall, forward Andrew Cristall, 40th overall. I'm jumbling that one up because I really could not believe that this kid was still available at number 40th overall, but we'll get into all of that. So Andrew Cristall, 40th overall, forward Patrick Thomas then at 104th overall, defenseman Cam Allen at 136th overall, forward Brett Hyland, 200th overall, and then goaltender Antoine Keller, 206th overall. So we will go over, like I said, all of these picks more in depth here. Starting, of course, with that number 8th overall selection, Ryan Leonard. Now, Ryan Leonard, if you don't know who this kid is, you should get familiar really quickly, because he's just big. He's a big dude. He's a big personality. He's just big on and off the ice. Big, strong, skilled power forward for the U.S. national team development program. He was projected by many of the most well-known and trusted scouts to go somewhere in the top 5 or 6 of this year's draft. But after 2 of the teams ahead of the Caps in the draft order, those being the Montreal Canadiens at number 5 overall and the Arizona Coyotes at number 6 overall. Those 2 teams, they made a couple of rather, I would say, curious picks, clearly drafting for their own organization's positional needs rather than employing the best player available strategy. The best player available strategy, which has proven time and time again to be the best way to conduct your draft day business in order to build a successful franchise. But Montreal and Arizona, like I said, they forego that best player available strategy here, and instead, like I said, they draft for positional need, and that position of need for them both apparently was a defenseman. So Montreal, they picked David Reinbacher at number 5 overall. And if Carey Price is listening to this, that's this kid's name, David Reinbacher. Anyone who missed it, Carey Price gets up on stage for the Montreal Canadiens organization, and he just completely forgets this kid's name. So he's like, we take David, right? Is that his name? David something? I don't know. David? Is there a David here? Like, he just completely spaced on the kid's last name. So I feel horrible for Carey Price there, but even more horrible for David Reinbacher, because it's a once in a lifetime moment. And Carey Price, the greatest goaltender arguably in Montreal Canadiens history. I say arguably because, of course, they have also employed guys like Patrick Waugh, Ken Dryden. So it would be arguable for sure. But Carey Price, at the very least, he's one of the best goaltenders of all time for that Montreal Canadiens organization. So he gets up there. He's set to call your name, and he just totally forgets your name. I can't even imagine. So anyways, Montreal picks David Reinbacher at number 5 overall, and Arizona then picks Dmitry Simashev at number 6 overall. And so Dmitry Simashev in particular, like he was projected to be a high pick, but like that one was quite a ways off the board there at number 6 overall. So he was projected to probably go outside of the top 10. And so that, like I said, those two selections really left that door open for the Caps 2 spots later, who were now guaranteed to be able to pick one of either Ryan Leonard or Matvei Mishkov, another prospect certainly of interest to the Caps. And so in my opinion, like you really could not go wrong drafting either of those guys if you're the Caps. I think Mishkov, he came with a lot of risk for most teams. But when you're talking about the Capitals specifically, I think he would have come with considerably less risk. Just, because given the Capitals' Russia connections and their proven ability time and time again to get the Russian players to come over to North America and sign here long term. But, it didn't really end up mattering as it ended up, being a non-factor here as the Philadelphia Flyers. They assumed the sizable risk for themselves at pick number 7, and they drafted the Russian. So that meant that Ryan Leonard, who has been nicknamed, among other things, the third Tkachuk brother, Tom Wilson Light. I've seen a few scouts calling him essentially what would happen if Tom Wilson and TJ Oshie were to have a baby. Like, that's kind of the player that he is. So, and he's earned those nicknames for, like, he has a rare combination of speed, skill, scoring ability, physicality, and just an overall in-your-face, I'm going to fuck you up style of playing the game of hockey. So he falls right into the Capitals' laps at number 8 overall. A true gift from the hockey gods. And Ryan Leonard, like, he's really got everything. Like, he is the full package. Like I said, he's got the size. He's got obviously the strength as well. He's got the speed. He's a really good skater. He's a highly skilled player. He's got elite hands and an elite shot, a very elite shot. Not only, the accuracy and like a lightning quick, insane really release of his shot, but there's a lot of it's a heavy shot. Like, there's a lot of power behind it, a lot of velocity behind it, and that's evidenced by the fact that he scored a whopping 51 goals in 57 games this past season. And he's also an elite playmaker, having added 43 assists in those 57 games as well, for a total of 94 points. And then, of course, there's also the added unique X factor to his game as well that made him even so much more attractive to so many teams around the NHL. So, we all knew, like, there was a lot of talent, a lot of skill in this year's draft class. But Ryan Leonard, like, he's really that one player in this draft class who he has, like I said, he has that X factor that's so rare, so unique. You just can't find it. Like, as NHL Network so aptly put it the night of the draft, they said there's 31 other teams in the league who are combing the world for a Tom Wilson. And here the Capitals have just added another one. So I thought that was very aptly put. Like, you cannot find these players. And for the Caps, like, when a guy like this falls into your laps, like I said, at number 8 overall, he was projected to go higher. So it's amazing for the Caps. And Ryan Leonard is, as Alan May said, a bull in a china shop rather, out on the ice. Scouts have described him as being probably the most competitive player in the entire draft. They've described him as a bulldog, an asshole on the ice, and as having, and I quote, muscles on his face. So, like, this kid's muscles have muscles. So, I think it's probably, pretty unjustifiable for those teams who were drafting ahead of the Caps here, to have let this kid slip through their fingers and fall all the way to the Caps at 8th overall. You just look at it as a Caps fan, you just look at it like, another man's huge mistake is our huge fortune here. And so I'll just shut up and say thank you. Thank you very much. Certainly not going to question it. So, Montreal, I know their fans were not very happy. Arizona, if they have any fans, they probably weren't very happy as well. But yeah, the Montreal Canadiens in particular, like, it's an Original Six organization, and they have done some some questionable drafting over the last few years. So their fans, they were pretty pissed off. But like I said, I think that's been building. It wasn't just a 2023 draft thing. It was the 2023 draft was that was the last straw for them. Like I said, though, if you're the Caps, you're happy. Not really caring what other teams think or feel. So anytime that you tell me that we can have another Tom Wilson type player, I'm going to be all over that personally. So like I said, thank you, Montreal. Thank you, Arizona. Thank you, Philly. Thank you, everyone. And to all, a good night. No, just kidding. We've still got more show to do here. Okay, so Ryan Leonard at 8th overall. And then the Caps, like I mentioned earlier, inexplicably, they somehow get Andrew Cristall all the way back at 40th overall. Like, I'm sorry, but how does that happen? Like, I saw mock drafts all year, scouting reports all year that had this kid going, top 10, top 12, top 15, probably at the worst. So, like, did all of the league's general managers just simultaneously fall asleep here? Because it sure seems like that's what must have happened. Like, this kid is so ultra talented, and according to multiple accounts, he also has the best personality of anyone in the whole draft as well. So analysts here were completely up in arms, in complete shock. First when he didn't go in the first round, and then again with every pick as he fell further and further, all the way, like I said, to the Caps at 40th overall, where the Caps again just said, thank you very much, you stupid fucks. For anyone who hasn't yet had the pleasure of seeing this kid play, he is a truly, truly unbelievable talent. He's from Vancouver, British Columbia, which is where I live, and he grew up playing with this year's number 1 overall pick, Connor Bedard, who of course is also from Vancouver. They started playing together apparently when they were about 5 or 6 years old, they said, and so they're actually like best friends, I guess, as well. Cristall is an unbelievable player, uber skilled, uber talented. In fact, many of the NHL scouts said he might even be the second most skilled player in this year's draft, second only to his best buddy, Connor Bedard. And they say, like, from a pure skill standpoint, Cristall might even be better than Bedard. Like, he's got unbelievable hands. He can pull off at full game speed some of the most unbelievable, just ridiculous trick shots you've ever seen, and he seemingly pulls them off every single time. So he's like a literal magician, a wizard with the puck, and probably the best playmaker in the entire draft as well. Like, he's got a great shot too, and for what it's worth as well, like, Connor Bedard says that Cristall is the smartest player he has ever played with in his entire life. So hockey IQ just totally off the charts as well. So anyone who has the Connor Bedard stamp of approval is probably a pretty damn good player. And there's another, just one more fun fact for Caps fans here as well that I wanted to toss in. As I happened to come across this stat after the Caps selected Cristall, but here's another connection between Cristall and Connor Bedard, which shows just how insanely good Cristall actually is. Western Hockey League players, all time, points per game in their draft year, all time. Do you want to venture a guess as to who's number 1 all time in points per game? If you guessed, of course, phenom Connor Bedard, you would be correct. But do you want to guess who's number 2 all time? Because number 2 all time is none other than Andrew Cristall. Number 2, like I said, right behind Connor Bedard, and ahead of guys, you'll recognize a lot of these names, ahead of guys like Leon Draisaitl, Braden Point, Matthew Barzal, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, who was a terrific junior player and who also just had a 100-plus point NHL season as well. Sam Reinhart, Seth Jarvis, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Again, like, I have no idea how this kid fell all the way to 40th overall. Like, literally no idea. My only guess, I suppose, would be maybe his size. He is a smaller guy, but then again, so are lots of guys in their draft years. These kids are only 17, 18 years old, so they still have a lot of room to put on a lot more muscle, and a lot of them do just that in the years following being drafted. So I don't really care how big he is at the moment, because skill is skill. And besides, like, with the way that the NHL is going these days, there's a lot more room in general for the smaller players to succeed in the NHL anyway. Like, we're seeing it every single season now, that these smaller players can have a huge impact in spite of their size. And, you know, in general, like, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog, as they say, right? So the Caps, they get a massive steal there at 40th overall. And if you're keeping track at home, that is 2 years in a row now where the Caps have been labeled as getting the steal of the whole draft, with Andrew Cristall this year, and of course with Ivan Miroshnichenko last year. So that is a hell of a way to ensure that you'll be just fine whenever the Alex Ovechkin era comes to an end, is to get yourself the steal of the whole draft 2 years in a row. Tidy business by Ross Mahoney, Brian McClellan, and co. And so then we move right along to 104th overall, where the Caps would select center Patrick Thomas, who was the leading scorer this past season of the OHL's Hamilton Bulldogs. But while Thomas obviously does provide offense as well, his biggest strength is how extremely defensively responsible he is. Like, he's just good defensively, as well as his superb penalty killing abilities as well. So think like something like an 18-year-old Nick Dowd, if you will. That obviously will certainly make Caps fans smile. And then shortly after that pick at 136th overall, the Caps then nabbed themselves another potential steal in defenseman Cam Allen. Now, Allen, he is a highly touted defenseman. He's Team Canada's captain, for one thing, and he was projected to go in the first round of this year's draft initially. So scouts obviously think very highly of him, and for good reason. He's played good defense and put up points at every single level, including, like I said, for Team Canada, where he's been a point-per-game defenseman for them. And as I mentioned, he's been chosen to be Team Canada's captain both times, so you know he's obviously got the off-ice character and the leadership abilities that teams always look for as well, or always looking for. And so, as if all of that wasn't enough, he was also a complete beast at the NHL's scouting combine, where he impressed scouts with his insane athletic ability by finishing in the top 10 of 11 different events. 11 different events. That's insane. I don't know how much, you guys pay attention to the NHL scouting combine, but that's pretty insane. So how does a kid like this, initially projected to go in the first round, end up falling all the way into the Caps' laps in the 5th round? Well, we can't answer that for you, as this past season, his season got derailed a little bit by a shoulder injury, and as well by his junior team, the Guelph Storm, changing coaches 2 separate times. So that's going to be tough for anyone. And then, still, even with a down year by his standards, mostly, like I said, for reasons that were out of his control, NHL Central Scouting, they still had him ranked as the 46th best player in their final rankings for the year, which is why NHL Network could not believe it when he was still sitting there for the Caps in the 5th round. The 5th round. Dave Reed of NHL Network stating that even with Allen's injury this season, they really did not expect this defenseman to last past the 2nd or the 3rd round of the draft. Like they said, 3rd round at the absolute latest was where this kid should have gone, and probably still in the 2nd round, even with, like I said, the injury this past season. So Dave Reed shared, this is what he said. He said, "This guy has been a stud of a defenseman since he was about 14 years old. He's always been consistent in that. He got injured this season. That wasn't his fault. His leadership abilities, his poise on and off the ice, his ability with the puck, and his ability to make plays under pressure is as good as anybody's out there. I think the Capitals got a real steal here." So the rest of the panel, by the way, agreed. So if the scouting report here is any indication, it sounds like the Caps, like I said, probably made out like bandits in the night again here, getting another highway robbery of a selection in the big right-handed defenseman. I like it. I like it a lot. There's a common theme here, if you've noticed, with these Caps picks, is a lot of steals, just as there was last year. So then, with the 200th overall pick, the Caps selected forward Brett Hyland, a point-per-game player for the Brandon Wheat Kings, who this past season was on a run of scoring 18 goals in his last 21 games before an injury ended his season on Valentine's Day. And yes, he did score in that Valentine's Day game as well before sustaining the injury. So that was supposed to be the end of the 2023 NHL Entry Draft for the Caps, as that was their last scheduled pick. But a few picks later at 206th overall, they saw a goalie still sitting there who they apparently liked enough to trade to get. And so they swapped 7th round picks with the San Jose Sharks, sending the Sharks their own 7th rounder in 2025 in exchange for San Jose's pick right then at 206 overall. And with it, the Caps selected goaltender Antoine Keller. So a cool side note to that is that he does become the first player in Capitals franchise history to be drafted out of France. And he's got exceptional statistics for the French national team too, rocking a .920 save percentage and a 2.15 goals against average, despite being one of the younger players in the program. So like a .920 save percentage and a 2.15 goals against, like those are good stats anywhere. Those are really good stats anywhere. When you're one of the youngest players in the program, it looks even better. So anyways, to sum up, the Capitals, like I said, they had a pretty fucking phenomenal draft, honestly, garnering an A+ draft grade from most analysts. And, you know, like I said, this is the second year in a row where that's the case. So in the last 2 drafts in particular, the Caps have been able to stockpile some serious offensive firepower, particularly in the form of elite wingers. In these last 2 drafts alone, they've added 4 indisputably elite wingers in obviously Ivan Miroshnichenko and Alexander Suzdalev at last year's draft, and then in Ryan Leonard and Andrew Cristall at this year's draft. And oh, by the way, in case you missed it, the Caps also managed to poach a top prospect, 2 of them in fact, from 2 different rival NHL clubs over the span of the last couple of days. First, convincing Matthew Phillips from the Calgary Flames organization to come and sign with the Caps organization instead. So Phillips, he's 25 years old. If you pay attention a lot to the NHL, you might have heard of this kid before, as he's been talked about quite a bit, especially over the past year here. So Phillips, he's 25 years old. And he was, like I'm saying, he's been talked about a lot, is because he's been highly sought after having led the AHL's top team from this past regular season in scoring. He scores a lot, and he's an AHL first team all-star. So it was reported that the Flames offered him more money on an extension than what the Caps were offering. But that the Caps were able to convince him to come anyway, thanks in part to a pitch made by new Caps assistant coach Mitch Love, who was the head coach of that top AHL team that Phillips played for last season. So those two obviously have a relationship, and so that's, like, it's obviously an excellent get of a promising young player for the Caps organization. And as usual, you know, it sucks to be Calgary. So, and then another big get for the Caps organization came hours later when it was announced out of nowhere that, like really out of nowhere, that Brian McClellan and co. Had also managed to poach Alex, I don't want to mess up his name, Alex Limoges, I believe is how you pronounce it, Limoges, from the Winnipeg Jets organization. So Limoges, I really don't want to mess up his name because he's from the DMV, right? Like, he's coming home. But yeah, he's another 25-year-old, highly touted forward prospect who was also the leading scorer of his AHL team this past season. So the Caps adding some more promising young talent there. At the very least, like, I know there's only so many spots on the NHL roster, but at the very least, the Hershey Bears are going to have a very good team. Once again, they just won the Calder Cup. They're going to obviously, you know, come back next season and be just as good. maybe even better. So the overall theme of this offseason for the Caps so far is, I would say, thievery, honestly. Like, whether it be steals at the draft or, like I said, poaching other organizations' top prospects. And, in both cases, like, I am very much here for it. Like, I love this. I love that they're just killing it at the draft. They're not being shy to, some of these highly touted prospects that aren't happy in other organizations, get in there, make a pitch to them, poach them if you can. And so now then, free agency. That's the other thing that we have to talk about. The Caps, they made a couple of acquisitions on day one of free agency, with one acquisition in the form of a signing and the other acquisition in the form of a trade. So first, they actually started the day off making a trade, that being with the Montreal Canadiens for defenseman Joel Edmundson. And that's a nice move for the Caps. He's a big, 6'5", 221 pounds, I believe. Big shutdown defenseman who's going to clear away the front of our net with gusto, which was an element that was, in my opinion anyway, at times it was missing for the Caps last season. So, Eric Gustafsson, as fun as he was to watch, he didn't bring a whole lot of that, did he? So the Caps decor gets bigger and more physical with this trade, which are two things that every team is always looking for around the trade deadline every single year, in preparation, of course, for the playoffs. And so Joel Edmundson, he is definitely both of those things. But he also makes a good first pass out of the zone, and he's just generally reliable defensively. He's a guy that you can put out there on the ice in any situation. He's also reportedly a great locker room guy as well, and was one of the favorite teammates of everyone, both on his most recent team, the Habs, and on the St. Louis Blues, with whom he won the Stanley Cup in 2019. So he's a proven winner. He seems to be, like I said, sought after at the trade deadline every single season for what he brings to the table. And so the way that I look at it, the trade cost us barely anything, right? And Montreal even retained half of his salary cap hit too, making it a cheap deal for us no matter which way you look at it. So it's essentially zero risk for the Caps. He's an unrestricted free agent after this season. And so the way that I look at it, like I said, either it'll work out here, we'll make the playoffs again, and we'll, of course, then be very happy to have him on our side for the playoffs. Or if it doesn't work out for whatever reason, then all of a sudden, we've got a pretty tasty trade chip to flip for an asset or two at the trade deadline, right? So him being a UFA and already having half of his salary retained would only make him even that much more attractive to teams at the deadline. So it's really a win-win either way for us Caps fans. And then shortly after trading for Edmundson, the Caps signed former Montreal Canadiens captain Max Pacioretty to a 1-year deal. So I just want to touch on as well, I saw a lot of Caps fans kind of subtly complaining, I guess you could say, that they didn't want the Caps to sign Pacioretty solely because he's 34 years old. And I'll tell you why that's the wrong way of looking at this. So yes, he is 34, but the dude can also still play. That's the most important thing, right? He can still play, he can still score, and he can still create goals for his line mates too, as evidenced by the fact that when you check out his last 82 games overall, he's got 42 goals and 91 points over that span. So that's a dude who can still very much play. And secondly, just like with the Joel Edmundson deal, Pacioretty is coming here on the cheap. We didn't have to give up any assets to get him. And he signed here for only $2 million. And like I said, it's a 1-year deal. So again, literally no risk on the Caps side of things. That's been a common theme here. Zero risk deals. And for Pacioretty, yeah, like I said, 1 year, cheap deal. If it doesn't work out, then you just let him walk at the end of the season. Or like I said, just as is the case with Edmundson, you flip them for assets at the deadline if you want to a team that needs some scoring help. So either way, again, it's a win-win if you're the Caps. So you literally can't lose in this deal. not at that price. Like, I mean, if anyone has a better idea of where to find a proven sniper who's capable of putting up 30 plus goals in his sleep at a $2 million cap hit, please, like, the floor is yours. Take it away. Tell us who you would get for $2 million who can, like I said, put up 30 plus goals in his sleep. But yeah, I mean, like, the only argument that I can sympathize with that makes some sense from Caps fans is that they don't want Pacioretty simply because they don't want him taking away a lineup spot from a younger player. And I get that side of it. I do. But like, even that, for me, it's kind of a weak argument just because, like, even with the Pacioretty signing, the Caps are still going to have several open roster spots available for the young players. Like, it's not like we had only one spot to fill, right? Like, we let a lot of guys, a lot of older guys, walk this offseason, right? So there's quite a few spots available to be taken by young players. So the ones, like, the guys who show up to training camp and have a good camp and deserve to make the team are the ones who will make the team. And the ones who don't, won't, right? It's pretty simple. So I don't think that anyone could or should argue, that young players aren't going to get a fair shot at it with Spencer Carberry, now the head coach, right? Like, we have to remember that too. It's not Peter Laviolette anymore. Like, the young players are going to get a fair shot at this. So, to me, like, saying that the young players aren't going to get a fair crack at it now that Spencer Carberry is the head coach, like, that wouldn't be a very sound argument to me. So, like I said, show up to camp, you'll get a more than fair shot at it, more than likely, and just perform well, make the team. It's pretty simple, right? So, okay, Caps fans, that's all we've got for you today. I think I've rambled on long enough here. As always, thank you all so much for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already done so. We love having you all here. Would not want you to miss a single episode of us talking about the team that we all love so much. So hit that subscribe button, tell your friends, tell your family, tell all of your fellow hockey fans. And until next time, babes, and as always, let's go Caps.